Okay, so as we were just talking about in the context of antioxidants and the fact that inflammation really is oftentimes, of course, setting aside more complex issues like obstructive azoospermia or some kind of a genetic issue causing azoospermia. When we're just talking about general support overall of sperm health, we have to be thinking about that in the context of the liver and the gallbladder from a Chinese medicine standpoint, and what that means from a sort of overall integrative standpoint as we're talking about processing of inflammatory molecules out of the body, preventing a buildup of inflammation in the body. So that is really the primary role of antioxidants. It's to neutralize free radicals, and that in turn frees up resources from the immune system so that the immune system is not on hyper alert, jumping at everything that it sees, and also so that the immune system can focus on things like, viruses or whatever else may be coming into the body, but not always on the verge of this hyper-inflammatory state, right? We've all learned so much through the course of the pandemic that people with excessive amounts of inflammation, when they then get a virus, for example, or a virus like COVID, then they're at risk for a cytokine storm. And the more inflammation somebody has going into the process, the greater the risk is for that immune system to go wild and overdo it with inflammation. Well, there's varying degrees of that. And from a fertility standpoint, an overactive immune system in men and in women is going to have a negative impact on the health overall of the gametes, and also the possibility that there's some, antibodies occurring within the sperm, within the female reproductive tract as well, that could be affecting sperm health. So antioxidants are vitally important to be, really replete with when one is going through the fertility process. And again, just for generalized health, we want to be focused a lot on reducing inflammation. So antioxidants include vitamin C, vitamin E, glutathione, which we just talked about, melatonin. Most people don't realize actually a very powerful antioxidant. Selenium, and CoQ10 also has an antioxidant function. The best sources of antioxidants, the best sources really of almost all nutrients, comes from foods. So seasonal fresh fruits and vegetables, number one, because they are so replete with antioxidant vitamins that help to reduce inflammation, vitamins like C and E. Raw oysters are very high in antioxidants, and then spices like turmeric and ginger, and also things like green tea, black tea, even coffee is very high in antioxidants. And remembering again, let's review this again quickly, that glutathione is made by the body. It is known as our master antioxidant. So its job is, we already have this built-in inflammation reduction system. And the reason why glutathione is so considered this master antioxidant is because it's very sticky and it's easy for it to adhere to the free radicals and get them out of the system. But toxins it helps everything pass out through the body. But the more toxins we have building up, the harder it is for the body to actually produce this thing it needs to stick to them and get them out. So then we need to think about supplementation. And the best sources are either liposomal, dermal, or ideally intravenous glutathione, or as we discussed, NAC, which is the precursor to glutathione. So what oxidative stress looks like then is, you have a normal cell, and then you have all these inflammatory free radical particles floating around, and then they come at the cell and attack it. And then that causes oxidative stress and essentially destroys the health of the cell. So by reducing the volume of free radicals in the body, reducing inflammation, and thereby cellular health will improve overall. Because sperm is a cell that is constantly reproducing. We're constantly making bazillions of these things every day. Well, we are not men are constantly making these every day, they're very prone to damage. They're very prone to being attacked by free radicals. So that's why reduction of inflammation, increase of antioxidants in order to downregulate inflammatory processes are extremely important, as both for men and women, but in higher doses, and just especially important for men in terms of overall lifestyle approaches as well. That like if there's not a lot of fruits and vegetables in the diet, really focusing on shifting that in particular.
So we just have a question that came in on break before Laura goes into the next section. So I'm just going to read it to you, Laura. They said you had talked about endometriosis. You talked about the impact of endometriosis on estradiol, egg quality, and IVF outcomes. Can you touch on this again, just the impact of endometriosis? Was it discussed with Dr. Orbach or in one of the modules? So that was from your in the mentorship, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so yes. And there's also a talk on this in the Healthy Seminars library, I believe, on endometriosis and adenomyosis. From the, am I right about that, Lauren? Maybe.
Yeah, so in the community library, there's a talk on that. And you're going to repeat some of these talks.
And I will repeat some of these, but in a nutshell.
And they're included in the mentorship, those recordings anyhow.
Yeah, so it's we talked about it with Dr. Orbach. There's also module 4, I believe, is where we covered endometriosis at length. And so there's a lot of discussion there in terms of the immunologic impact. What's important to understand about endometriosis is that it is tissue that is hormone sensitive tissue. And it is displaced outside of the uterus. In the uterus, as the tissue responds to the hormones throughout the course of the cycle, when it's no longer being used, meaning the cycle is over, there's no pregnancy, it has a place to go. It sheds out and it leaves through the uterine, through the cervix. Endometrial tissue, which is also hormone sensitive tissue, is responding throughout the cycle in the same way that the stuff inside the lining is responding. It's getting thicker, it's increasing vascularization. It has the additional bonus feature of making its own estrogen, which the lining does not. So in addition to growing, it's also making estrogen. So that's throwing off the estrogen progesterone balance in the body, creating a state of estrogen dominance, even though it's not coming from the follicles and the lining, it's coming from those endometrial lesions. The issue with the inflammation part and why it affects egg quality and why it affects the ovaries over time is because that same bleeding that's happening out through the cervix is happening into the peritoneal cavity of the patient with nowhere to go. There's no exit. So the body perceives that as internal bleeding. That's why there's so much pain. One of the reasons why there's so much pain. That internal bleeding is responded to by the immune system through a whole cascade of events that involves stuff to stop the bleeding, to, prevent infection. So all kinds of white blood cells and natural killer cells, macrophages are accumulating in that region of the body and doing all it can to stop this internal bleeding that, remember, is occurring on repeat, cycle after cycle. As that repetitive internal bleeding occurs inside the patient's peritoneum, the body begins to lay down scar tissue over the lesions, because after a while, it's got to stop this from continuing to happen. That scar tissue then becomes this adhesive, these adhesive bands that stick together, cause the pelvic organs to stick together, distort the shape of them, cause issues with the rectum, the bladder, the colon, all the way throughout the peritoneal cavity. So those are, I hope that's enough of a nutshell of it, but those are the primary reasons. The immunologic extra activity in the pelvic cavity translates to potential immunologic infertility, because if you have a high volume of immune cells in the region of the uterus, there's nothing to stop those cells from going after an embryo. So you're going to have the potential of implantation failure over and over again, not because there's anything wrong with the embryo, but because there's this inflammatory response in that area that's impacting inflammation. So that inflammation has to be dealt with before an embryo transfer. In a natural setting, that's a different story. We're trying to do it the whole time. But because we have to exacerbate the condition to some degree for IVF, and that's just part of the deal, unfortunately, we have to then clean up the mess essentially before you do a transfer. Otherwise, you're going to have this immunologic risk. It's a pretty significant risk that the transfer won't work because of that.